Now we're reading from Romans chapter 15, beginning in verse 18 through 21 from the New American Standard. For I will not presume to speak of anything except what Christ has accomplished through me, resulting in the obedience of the Gentiles by word and deed, in the power of signs and wonders, in the power of the Spirit, so that from Jerusalem and around about as far as Illyricum, I have fully preached the gospel of Christ. And thus I aspired to preach the gospel not where Christ was already named, that I might not build upon another man's foundation, but as it is written, they who had no news of him shall see, and they who have not heard shall understand. Preach the word.
Well, I am really glad to be able to share with you another legend in missions. How many of you may have met Parker Henderson? Good number of our faculty have met Parker Henderson. Not many students have met Parker Henderson. How many of you students have heard of Parker Henderson? Not very many. Well, you're going to hear about him today. And it's important that you know that there are people in another generation who did what Paul did. And that is go to people who had never heard of Jesus and preach Jesus and bring them to Christ and make them a part of God's eternal kingdom. And that's why I'm doing this series on Legends in Missions, to let you know, as students and as faculty, that it is possible for people sitting in this room to do what these great missionaries of the past did, because they are just like you. They were at one time, just young people who maybe had a dream of preaching Christ somewhere in the world. Now, Parker Henderson was a missionary for 52 years. He was a missionary for 22 years in Thailand and for 30 years in Trinidad. And during those 52 years, he would spend summers preaching the gospel in India. And Dr. Gary Walker is here with us, and Gary was a part of those India campaigns. And you'll see one of the posters, a little bit dog-eared with time, but this was one of the posters that was pasted all over the city. I think how many? 500 of these were printed, and 5,000 of these were printed and just pasted everywhere, all over the city where Parker was going to be preaching, and great crowds would come out to hear the gospel of Christ in India. Why India, you might ask, when he was already a missionary in Thailand or Trinidad? Well, it goes back to the days when he was a young soldier, and he was stationed in what was then Calcutta, India. And when he saw the poverty and the idolatry and the condition of people in one of the dirtiest cities of the world, in Calcutta, he had compassion. And he said, and kind of made the decision as a conscientious objector that was a medic in the army. And he was stationed there, and when he had compassion on those people, he said, I am going to be a missionary, and I'm going to bring Christ to these people. Well, he couldn't get permission at that time to be a missionary in India. He came to Abilene Christian College, and in chapel one day at Abilene Christian, a Christian businessman came and told the story in chapel of doing business in Thailand, in Bangkok, Thailand, and he said, there is no church as far as I know, and none of these people know about Christ or the Church of Christ. Somebody ought to go there and be a missionary and take Christ to that country. Parker made up his mind at that point that he would try to become a missionary in Thailand. And that is what he did. But every summer, he would spend time in India. He preached the gospel during those summer campaigns in that city. Now, Calcutta has a different name now, like many of the other ancient cities of India. But it was called Calcutta then, and he would come back in the summers after he became a missionary in Thailand, and he would preach in that city where he made the decision to become a missionary. And if you want to know about those India City campaigns, you can see one of those campaign banners, and you can talk to Gary Walker, who planned those campaigns and set the stage for Parker to preach the gospel to thousands of people through the years in India. Now, Parker not only was interrupted his mission work in Thailand and Trinidad to preach in the summertime in India, but Parker also took his furlough back to the U.S. about every 5 years to become a teacher at SIBI. So at Sunset School of Preaching then, Parker would come and spend a year or so every 5 years on his furlough, the time when missionaries are supposed to rest, right? from their labors in their mission field. He would come and he would teach at Sunset. And you can see the years that he did that over a period of about 20 years or so. He would come here every 5 years or so, and he would teach. But now he had a dual purpose for that. Not only was he able to teach the gospel to future gospel preachers, but he was in the business of recruiting students in this school to become missionaries. And he recruited and trained a bunch of mission teams while he was there. Now, at this next picture, you're going to see about 6 guys there on the front row. Those 6 guys were sitting in the classroom as students here when Parker Henderson inspired them, or at least 4 of them, inspired them to become missionaries in Thailand. Now, these guys were all contemporaries with me when I was a student here in the school, and then when I came back to do some teaching in the 70s and 80s, teaching a class or 2. These were the guys that I got to know there, and then later got to know them on mission fields in Asia and other places. But these guys were great missionaries. All of them now are deceased, except for that one guy on the left, Larry Henderson, who is Parker Henderson's son, who also was a student here at Sunset. And Larry is still alive, and thankfully he gave me some of these pictures because we had very few of them here in our possession. Now, there is a story that I want to tell you that relates back to Parker's mission work. It's a story about a man named Kampao Siramanabang. Back in the 80s, there were people that became refugees from the oppressive governments of Cambodia and Laos. And in Phoenix, where I was preaching at the time, that was one of the centers where these refugees were housed and where they were dispersed into the community. And there was an ad in the newspaper that said, we're looking for organizations and families that will sponsor some of these refugees and help them become absorbed into the community and get jobs and that sort of thing. Well, the wife of one of our deacons was very compassionate, and she said, this is something that we Christians ought to do. And so she signed up to host a family with this organization that was dispersing the refugees. And she got the agreement of a bunch of other people at the church to help with this project. And she asked the people in charge, would it be all right if we invite the family that you've assigned to us at random, could we invite them to church? And they said, sure, we don't care what you do about their religion. If they're willing to come, most of them are Buddhist, but if they're willing to come to church with you, then you have our permission. Well, she brought Kampao, his wife, and 4 or 5 little kids to our church one Wednesday night, and she stuck the kids in one of the kids' classes, and none of them spoke English. But as the kids' class began to sing some of the little songs, Jesus loves me, Jesus loves the little children, the kids were singing in the Laotian language to the same tune. And we wondered, how'd they know those songs if they're Buddhist? Well, that same deacon's wife later on took Kampao down to the employment agency so that he could find a job. And they said, could I see your Social Security card? He didn't know what a Social Security card was, and so he just threw all of his cards that he had in his wallet out on the table. And among those cards was one card that read like this: I am a member of the Church of Christ. I was converted in a refugee camp in Thailand by Jim Lane. Jim Lane was one of the Sunset School of Preaching students that Parker Henderson recruited to go to Thailand. And Jim was preaching in that refugee camp in Thailand and converted Kampao Siramanabang, who came to the United States along with a lot of those other refugees that were converted there. And right now, there are Laotian congregations peppered across the United States because of the work of students from this school that were trained and recruited by Parker Henderson. Now, one of the other things that you need to learn about some of these legends in missions is that they were family-oriented people. They had families that they took to the mission field with them. In fact, go ahead and change the slide. In fact, missionary wives are pretty important. Now, when Parker Henderson heard that appeal about becoming a missionary in Thailand, he already had a gal that he was planning to marry. And so he said to Donna, I plan to be a missionary, and I would love for you to be my wife, but in order to be my wife, you have to be willing to be a missionary with me. And Donna said, I'll go anywhere in the world that you want to go. They got married, and they went to Thailand. And I want to tell you, you ladies sitting here, you are every bit as important as the guy that is preaching and teaching in some of these arrangements. Donna was a great missionary partner and was so important to the mission. And kids growing up on the mission field are vital to the plan. And sometimes maybe parents and grandparents kind of feel, oh, if you take these lovely children to the mission field, oh, they'll just be destroyed. The opposite is true. We took 4 kids to the mission field, and they look back on that time that they were in Africa as one of the greatest times in their life. And these children that Parker and Donna Henderson had on the mission field, Larry and 3 sisters, one of the sisters here in Lubbock, all of these children, except one, became missionaries themselves. The one lady that did not become a missionary is the wife of an elder who has served the Lord faithfully for years and years. I'm telling you that having kids and growing up on the mission field with those kids is not a detriment, it's an asset. And those kids learn some kingdom priorities, and they're able to continue the legacy of missions years and generations to come. Go ahead and change the slide. Now, there was one other Henderson that was not in that first picture. He's a Thai boy named Timothy that Parker and Donna lived long enough, lived out their days, their last days here in Lubbock at a nursing home, but they lived long enough to see young Timothy grow up, become a gospel preacher, and then become a missionary in the Caribbean. What a wonderful legacy they left through those fabulous years. And the young man that you see there with dark hair, that's Larry Henderson, who now has raised some of his kids to be missionaries. Well, what does a missionary do? Well, Parker Henderson was all about preaching the gospel and letting people know about Jesus, whether he was in India or Thailand or Trinidad. And so planting new congregations, preaching the gospel, all of that is foundational to what missionaries do. They preach Christ. They make disciples. And then they bring those disciples together in the body of Christ, the local church, where they can be edified and they grow in the kingdom. And Parker did that all over Thailand, in the city of Bangkok, and in the villages where relatives of the people that he converted in Thailand would be living. He would go out into the villages with them and plant congregations and preach the gospel in those villages, and new congregations were planted. And then he would begin to train some of those young men to be gospel preachers. And every place Parker went, whether he was in Thailand or whether he was in the Caribbean, in Trinidad, he was training the next generation of gospel preachers. He would do that here at Sunset, but he would do it where he was on the mission field. And he left behind gospel preachers in all of those nations where he preached. And then he was able, before he left Thailand, to see elders appointed in some of the churches in Thailand. They had matured the congregation to the point that some of those churches could have elders that carried on the work of that local church. Well, finally, Parker Henderson, and that's sort of how he looked when he got back from 52 years on the mission field. And he and Donna lived out at a place out on North Milwaukee Avenue called the Rocking Chair. And it was kind of a little group nursing home, assisted living place. And I would visit Parker and Donna out there, and Parker would talk about the old days when he was in Thailand and when he was in Trinidad. Now, when he went to Trinidad and spent 30 years, he established the school of preaching that still exists in Trinidad. And he trained hundreds of missionaries, hundreds of preachers in that school in 30 years who have gone all over the Caribbean islands and have planted churches and preached the gospel. And Donna was vital to that effort because Donna was a great singer. And she would teach the young preachers music so that they could learn how to teach other people to sing and so that they could lead singing. What a great legacy Parker Henderson left for us. One of these days, maybe I can tell you about the 30 years in Trinidad. We've kind of focused on India and Thailand, but those 30 years in Trinidad were just as vital and just as important. Well, what can students and faculty in this school learn from this legend in missions? Number one, you can learn that compassionate hearts can be open to missions. When you see what's going on in the world, you see the lost, you see the poverty, you see the cruelty of people against people, and you see the people oppressed and depressed. Do you have compassion on them? If you do, you might have a heart that's opened to becoming a missionary. It was when Parker saw Calcutta, India, that he said, I must be a missionary and take Christ to people like this. Second lesson we learn is longevity on the mission field is important. Among your teachers are those who have spent decades on mission fields. And the longevity of people like this legend in missions has produced a harvest that still is existing and still is carrying on. Third lesson, evangelism and church planting are foundational to the mission. You don't just go there and open up an office and expect people to sign up. You evangelize. You plant churches. You preach the gospel because it's the gospel that saves. Fourth lesson, training local leaders is essential for future growth. Whatever you do on the mission field, you have to train the next generation of leaders. Some of you are the result of someone doing that, where you were converted and where you found Christ, and now you're here because someone cared enough to begin to train you for the next generation. Fifth lesson that you need to learn is that family faithfulness is part of the mission. You can't just go to preach the gospel and forget about your family and say, my mission is to reach out to other people. Your family is part of your mission. And if you save the world and lose your family, what have you accomplished? So make sure that you understand that family faithfulness is part of your mission as a missionary. Well, maybe there will be other times when we can have studies on some other legends in missions, but I'm thankful that we've had the opportunity to talk about Parker Henderson, one of my great friends, and what a great, great missionary he was. Thank you.